Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Don't be shy, you can come up to the front if you like, or you can be socially distanced at the tables. That's probably not a bad idea. My name is Sam Bartlett. I'm a director at the Green Hydrogen Organisation. My primary responsibility is this document, the Green Hydrogen Standard. There'll be a session about that this afternoon, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. The standard focuses on green hydrogen production, and this session is focused more on green hydrogen utilisation. And one of the issues that's most contentious and interesting in our community is the question of green hydrogen blending. For some, it's the smartest way to kickstart a green hydrogen economy. For others, view it as a misstep and a step backwards. And that's what our panel is going to tackle today. I'd like to start by introducing Matthias from Agora, who's going to help kick things off by kind of defining what we mean by blending with a bit more specificity. So over to you.
Thank you. We should by now see my title slide, or could I just click on next? Yes, so there it is. Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Sam. My name is Matthias. I'm heading the hydrogen program at Agora Energiewende, which is an independent think tank with like 100 people across the globe, a lot of them in Berlin, but also many of them in Brussels. And let me try to connect a bit the dots as we see them between this issue of blending and the bigger hydrogen picture. You and I, we were all here when it happened. And by that I mean in particular yesterday morning when IRENA, IEA, Bloomberg New Energy Finance and the Energy Transitions Commission came together and showed all their good work on hydrogen. And there's a lot of good stuff, I can tell you. And we have tried to make things a bit easier to digest because not all of us are energy system modelers and look at hydrogen numbers for 2050 all day long. And so if you happen to have some time, you can look into this publication in which we compared exactly those scenarios plus one or two others to show what the future holds. We call it 12 Insights on Hydrogen. And then we figured just quantitative comparisons are sometimes still for the experts and the initiated. And there was this one thing missing, and you may have seen different variants of it, and that's what I'm going to share with you now to connect the dots. Because if you see those scenarios, you want to derive conclusions for actual policy making, which is important in this ramp-up phase of the hydrogen economy. If you get confused about what to do next, you will lack this important insight on what the, I think, British minister said yesterday, be wise in using your taxpayers' money. You cannot throw it at everything at the same time. You'll be totally confused what to do next. So what we developed based on those scenarios is some guidance, admittedly simplified, but for the big line of thinking to guide policymaking. And so this is what I'm run with you through now. So essentially, we think policy should focus on what we call no-regret hydrogen applications, especially when it is about big-time funding, subsidizing policy support schemes. So there are some applications, and that relates to all sectors, which is interesting, where hydrogen will be needed. And when I say sectors, I mean those kind of typical sectors, industry, transport, power sector, buildings, and what we call no regrets. And that is not a surprise, but that's what you find in all those scenarios, more or less. It's about non-energy use in industry. It's like DRI steel making, it's feedstock, all those who already deal with molecules daily. It's their business. They depend on molecules. It's about long-range transport by flying, for shipping, maritime, and then the power sector. That depends a bit on your country. But renewables need backup. They need dispatchable power plants. Again, we've discussed it with our China colleagues. Not the same everywhere, But if you have big seasonality issues like Central Europe, you rely on dispatchable power plants in the future. And then finally buildings. This is a bit special, very European, I have to admit. Central, Northern, Eastern Europe, district heating. Similar thing to power backup, you need kind of heat backup in your centralized heating systems. Scandinavians are great in going forward with 100% renewables. Some others have more difficulty. You will need some backup, at least for a longer transformative and transition period. So this is the thing that I think where the discussion is clearly rooted in substantial energy scenarios across the globe. And in our publication, you also see some European scenarios compared. And I'll getting to an end, Sam. So that's the point. And then there is a bit more difficulty in fine nuancing about this. Controversial applications, high temperature industry heat, yeah, but there's competition between direct electrification and indirect electrification through molecules. Trucks, buses, we could discuss that in length, and that's why it's controversial, because there's competition. That's good. So we have technology choices, and then we have the really bad ideas as we see them. It's low temperature heat, let's say below 100 degrees Celsius. There really are smarter solutions, and you guys know them. Let's call them heat pumps for simplification, and then building heat cars, passenger cars. Just look at the numbers. Where does the global market stand for cars, for molecules? Yet a final thought on blending. Why does that matter for the blending question? Because there's sometimes confusion on terminology. Blending, let me be more specific, grid-level blending in grids, that is a bad idea, we think, but on-site blending, if somebody makes kind of a conscious private choice on his property, on his industrial site, to blend something there, that may be relevant, especially for no-regret applications during the transition. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you two examples. One is steel making. One is in the power sector. Why? Because steel makers are planning for DRI steel making first with natural gas. Getting a bit more difficult now with current natural gas prices, but still that's the idea. And then gradually increasing the share of hydrogen. So that is an on-site blending process, if you wish. That's their choice, it's their economics, it's their calculation, it's their thing. Similar, we're having this debate on where European gas power plant manufacturers want to be by 2030, or say the late 2020s with prototypes. They want to have them 100% hydrogen ready. The time to that point is a bit difficult. We could argue about the details of hydrogen readiness, but that's not my point. The point is they will need to deal with this key uncertainty. Where's the hydrogen, in which volume, at what cost? In order to make that transition work for them, they care about on-site blending. Most people, when they hear blending, think, oh yeah, that's grid-level blending. No, I just want to kind of make this more clear that this is important to distinguish. Otherwise, we may not talk kind of at the same wavelength with each other. That's all I wanted to say. Sorry, Sam, I think I doubled my time, but thank you very much. You can look up some of this stuff in our publications, and then thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have John Batala Bejanaro, President of Sedigas.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and especially after the intervention of Matthias, I think that it was quite provocative. And I think that it's nice to guarantee an interesting debate. He was talking about the opportunities for blending of hydrogen. And let me start giving some data about Spain. In Spain, more than 60% of the demand is for industrial demand. 20% is just for electricity generation, combined cycles. And as an association, we consider that it's extremely relevant, the blending, in order to decarbonize this final demand. Hydrogen is an opportunity in order to decarbonize natural gas sector in Spain with a huge potential. Hydrogen, more than 200,000 megawatts. And if you add and you consider the biomethane, I think that it's possible to decarbonize the full natural gas demand for industrial, residential, and combined cycles for electricity generation. We consider that it's extremely relevant in this strategy of decarbonization of the Spanish economy, the natural gas sector in Spain, obviously, to use this integrated energy approach, using and taking profit of the different energy carriers, where the renewable gases, the hydrogen, green hydrogen, and other renewable gases such as biomethane could contribute to the decarbonization of this demand. In Spain, this capacity, as has been pointed in these sessions, the potential of hydrogen, the potential of biomethane, it's one of the most relevant in Europe, and we can take profit of this potential. Obviously, blending has limits, but we consider that it's a first step in the decarbonization strategy in Spain. We have to tackle the bottlenecks, the regulatory and technical bottlenecks, and in this regard, in the association, in the Spanish National Association, we are just working on that, trying to provide regulatory solutions and technical solutions in order to promote the blending and identifying which are the most relevant aspects to be solved and contributing to the energy transitions based on economic efficiency, security of supply, and sustainability. It was foreseen a presentation. I don't know the reason, but suppose some technical problems. But in the presentation, you have information about this think tank with the participation of the most relevant institutions and companies in Spain, such as the National Center for Hydrogen, the Spanish Association of Hydrogen, and the most relevant companies, transport, distribution, suppliers, in order to find solutions through the hydrogen vector. Thank you.
Apologies for not getting your presentation up in the right time. Next, Fleur de la Cruz. Thank you for joining us at the 11th hour, as it were, for joining this panel. Wood Mackenzie is working around the world on, obviously not just green hydrogen projects, at advising clients on grey and blue as well. Perhaps you could share some insights. We've had a fairly European perspective so far, but there's also a vibrant debate about blending in the US.
Yes.
So, yeah, please.
Absolutely. So, like Sam said, we cover hydrogen on a global scale, so we get to actually know firsthand some of the challenges that different regions are experiencing when it comes to hydrogen blending, and not taking away that the end-use sectors are very important, which I completely agree. So, just to give you a bit of a background, we track projects all around the world, and when we started retroactively tracking some projects from 2014, about 50% of those projects said that the end-use sector was going to be blending into the natural gas grid. By 2019, the number of projects that said that was under 25%, and now it's really a mix, and it's more focused on export and turning that hydrogen into ammonia to export it around the world. That doesn't solve the problem of how do you get that hydrogen from the port to the end-use sector. These industry consumers in Spain, industry consumers in Germany, and around the world, you still need to get it to them. In our recently published midstream cost report, when we tried to analyze what the cost of transporting hydrogen around the world would be and how much that would add to the cost of production, which is already prohibitively high for certain industrial consumers, we saw that transporting hydrogen via compressed trucks was about $1.50 a kilo, which basically is a no-go for certain industrial consumers already struggling with high natural gas prices. Transporting this hydrogen in by blending it into the natural gas grid, we saw that could bring down the cost to about 30 to 60 cents per kilo of hydrogen, depending on the scenario, how much hydrogen you're trying to transport. And in the recently published European Hydrogen Backbone report, that can be as low as 10 cents to 20 cents per kilogram of hydrogen by either retrofitting some of these hydrogen pipelines and also injecting some of that hydrogen into the gas grid. But that's not the end of it, right? Some of these infrastructures around the world aren't that young. When we look at the infrastructure, transmission natural gas infrastructure in the US, it was all built around the 50s. And when we talk to our natural gas transmission analysts in the US, they're actually starting to cover more and more incidents from leaks in these natural gas pipelines in the US that are leading to more and more fires, explosions around the world. We may not get that news here, but just a point, we have planes that fly over them. so we can actually gather some of this data, which is pretty cool, I think. It's a completely different case in Europe. The pipelines here aren't that old, and at the end of the day, it really comes down to your steel specification, as may it be 3112 for, I guess, those more with an engineering background. And SNAM actually recently stated that about 70% of their pipelines are hydrogen compatible, and it would be a question of actually just changing some of the other transmission, the compressors, maybe some of the metering stations, and so on. So it's a very different story with the age of your infrastructure, the age of what it's going into. But at the end of the day, it's a cost question, right? If you want to get that hydrogen to your industrial consumers, and you have to go for the lowest cost pathway, and that is pipelines. We've seen some off-takers essentially drop projects because the cost is too high to transport the hydrogen from the production source to the demand source, and they're waiting for the hydrogen to decrease in cost. But if that midstream cost is still there, they might never actually start consuming hydrogen. And that is a risk we're starting to see with some of these hydrogen projects getting off the ground. Thank you.
Great. And last but most, yeah, please. And last, certainly but not least, Professor David Sebon. You're going to tell us about the Hydrogen Science Coalition, about your work more widely on hydrogen, but also your specific views on the question of blending.
Thanks, Sam. I'm not going to talk about the Hydrogen Science Coalition. Except to say it's a small group of scientists and academics who are focused on trying to get some accurate numbers around the science of mainly use of hydrogen. I'm fully in favour of green hydrogen as part of the energy transition. It's essential in various applications, and it's essential to build a strong green hydrogen industry. But unfortunately, I think in this regard, blending isn't helpful, and that's what I'm going to argue. And I think that blending will cause a drag. It'll drag the industry into unwinnable arguments, which will ultimately delay your progress, and that would be bad for the energy transition. So what I'd like to do is just explain what I think those arguments are. So the first argument is about decarbonisation. All right, so what are the reasons that you might blend hydrogen? Well, the first is decarbonisation, to put you out of your misery. The second is about the energy transition, and the third is about making money. So let's just take those three one at a time. So decarbonisation, we know that we can only blend about a maximum of about 20% hydrogen into the gas grid. After that, we get into all sorts of problems with pumping, with embrittlement and so on. We have to replace all the pumping stations the next step is 100%. After 20%, that requires 3 times the pumping power, 3 times, all pumps have to be replaced, most pipes have to be replaced. So that's not going to happen. So at 20%, because the calorific value of hydrogen is only 1/3 of the calorific value of the natural gas that it replaces, it means that the energy content of the blend is about 86% of the energy content of what you started with. That means you've got to put a lot more, another 20% through the pipes to get the same amount of energy to the consumers. So the consequence of that is you only get about a 6% reduction, 6 to 7% reduction in carbon from the same volume of gas. There's a recent IRENA report which said that blending was the highest cost of mitigating carbon, and they put at current current gas and electricity prices, they said that mitigation cost of carbon using blending was about $500 a tonne. So $500 a tonne, it's way more than is going to be economic at any foreseeable time in the future. So the most expensive way to decarbonise gas is by blending. It's much better to use green hydrogen to decarbonise those high merit applications, the ones that Matthias just showed us, industrial applications, fertilizer, petrochemicals, steel. Otherwise, the green hydrogen project is likely to end up in the trough of disillusionment of the Gartner hype cycle. You've seen that. The prices will be way too high, projects will fail, and there's just a very good chance of ending on the rocks of disaster. So decarbonisation is not the right reason. Second is to help the energy transition. So, okay, we're going to blend because of the energy transition. So key, from what I understand, the key components of the energy transition are, first of all, use less energy. Use less energy, and that means use highly efficient processes. Let's be smarter about our use of energy. Let's not waste it, because after all, it's got to be made by renewables. Renewables are scarce. And we heard some interesting discussion about the difficulty of making enough renewables in the other room. So the second thing is to maximize renewables, right? So you use less energy, you maximize renewables. So the aim of blending, apart from the industrial applications that Matthias has mentioned, the aim of blending is home heating. Now, it takes 6 times more electricity to heat a home with a hydrogen boiler than it takes to heat the same home with a heat pump. 6 times. You need 6 times more wind turbines. So this is the least efficient way to heat a home. There is no less efficient way to heat a home. So if we're trying to help the energy transition and we're going for something which uses 6 times more wind turbines, then this is not helping. So it's a poor solution for both energy efficiency and renewables. And if you argue for hydrogen for home heating, you will have the tree huggers and the greenies will have an absolute field day, and they'll take you apart. So I wouldn't go there. You know, if you want to have your project end on the rocks, go try and push hydrogen for home heating, which is where blending is going. The third is making money. So the problem with blending is it causes something like a 16 to 30% increase of costs of heating homes to consumers. Right? So that's all the consumers suddenly got their prices increased by 16 to 30% for no benefit. Right? The same amount of heat. So why would you target that application? That's an application where you're bound to maximize your drag. It's much better to use hydrogen applications where it's essential for customers, where it doesn't increase customer costs, and where you don't have these incredibly difficult transport issues. You know, the hydrogen industry in the world is one where hydrogen is made and used in the same place because it's such a dog to transport hydrogen. It's so difficult because of its thermodynamic properties that you make it and you use it in the same place. Bring your electricity into your steel works, make your hydrogen, reduce your steel. There's no reason to do blending to do that. So there's plenty of business in those high merit applications. There's 120 million tons of hydrogen used in the year in the world. That will substantially increase if steel making, we go for direct reduction of iron. That will really dramatically ramp up the amount of hydrogen needed in the world. These are areas where there's no choice, right? There is no choice. There is no alternative to hydrogen for fertilizer production. So governments will be forced to lubricate the financial environment in those areas. There's no choice. Carbon taxes, rebates, whatever it is, have to happen. So if you want to focus on decarbonisation or the energy transition or making money, then you won't go near blending. It's a completely dead end, and it will be met by huge opposition, and that will cause delay and confusion in the green hydrogen revolution. So is it a fast, you asked us, is it a fast start or a misstep? It's absolutely a misstep.
Thank you so much. A round of applause first for this initial. One of the things I like about all of our speakers, and I guess it's a thread running through our work at GH2, is a focus on an evidence-based discussion. A lot of people say that we live in a kind of post-truth world, I think that one of the things that we're committed to as at GH2 is bringing stakeholders together, assembling evidence and talking it through. I've got about 1,000 questions, but I've already spoken too much this week. I'm going to open it up to the floor shortly. We haven't touched on one thing that I think is particularly baffling, and that's the use of blue hydrogen in blending, which to me seems just crazy. You have natural gas, you turn it into hydrogen, and then you mix it back with natural gas again. Sometimes when I hear about projects like that, I'm looking for the hidden cameras. It just doesn't make sense from a physics perspective or a common sense perspective, and yet there are many of those projects out there. My question, my pathology as an economist, is to sort of ask the question, is the market going to solve this problem for us? If there are, as you put it at the outset, Matthias, better uses for hydrogen, can we simply trust that the demand for hydrogen from the steel sector, for example, will be such that it won't make sense economically to blend, so that problem solved? So that, I guess, is my question to you. Will the market sort this out for us, I guess is my question. I don't know who wants to respond.
If you allow me, I would kind of circumvent this question for 1 second, because I just realized in the way you asked the question, I think David had one argument not brought forward, and I just wanted to remind ourselves that we are operating, dealing with a world where molecules are used by some very important stakeholders today in industries, in the chemical industry. And just to remind ourselves, when we talk about blending, we're talking about leaving a defined gas quality and moving to something that is much less clear, especially if you have kind of variable infeed through renewable hydrogen, when it can go up and down. I just want to remind ourselves, today there are industries working with a defined gas quality, and there was a whole dialogue by the German government, the Ministry of Economics, some years ago, called Gas 2030 Dialogue. So we have a ministerial document in Germany that clearly states, oh, here's a red flag. There's some industries that would suffer if they receive blends at their site. So they are against that. In fact, they would need to have additional investment and cost to purify this blend to get back to either traditionally interested in 100% natural gas, or if they make a switch to hydrogen, 100% hydrogen. But delivering through public grids a blend which is an undefined, maybe a variable quality, is really kind of a punch in the face of this industry. And you find public statements from the European chemical industry to say, yeah, we don't want blends in our grids. Just to, I think, add to this important perspective that there may be some who can digest that, but others can't. Do we want them to have additional cost by imposing this? I just wanted to add this, and sorry for circumventing your question.
I guess one of the other things that's challenging about this, and it's the same with our work on the standard, on the sort of production side, is that countries are in very different situations and circumstances. You've obviously focused on the situation here in Spain. The situation in the US is different, where they have enormous gas resources there that they're tapping into. So there's a very vibrant blue hydrogen debate in the US, similar in Australia, where I'm from. So I think that's sort of the local context. One of the questions that we've had a couple of times at GH2, there was a proliferation of national hydrogen strategies in the last 18 months. But most of them are light on specifics. And so there's lots of ministries around the world now sort of taking the next step with their national hydrogen strategy and looking at international best practice. And we get questions saying, it's been suggested to us that in order to catalyse green hydrogen production, that mandating a small blending in the grid, that would instantaneously create the kind of incentive to get these green hydrogen production projects moving. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying there are plenty of people asking that very question at the moment, is that when we talk about an enabling policy environment for green hydrogen production, that idea is out there. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Is there anyone in our audience that would like to sort of weigh in or ask a question? Please, Marta. please come and take the microphone.
Thank you. So, Mr. Joan Batalla Berejano was mentioning that there is the possibility in Spain to substitute all the molecules now running in the natural gas or fossil gas, we should call it, grid by renewable molecules. So I made some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and actually, if you use all the EU electricity production, all of it, including the gas-fired production, we will be able to substitute only 45% of the energy that now runs in the European fossil gas grid. So my question is, how much green electricity would we need to achieve that 100% substitution in the grid, and how many wind turbines, how many solar panels, how many resources that such an idea need? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Just here in the presentation, it was the figures. Some of the figures of the potential of renewable gases in Spain. Hydrogen, 210 terawatts hour. In terms of biomethane, 137%. And the industrial gas demand in Spain, it's around 60% of the total demand. In Spain, it's 378%. So it's a first estimation of the potential of renewable gases, and especially hydrogen, and in the short term, biomethane, in order to decarbonize the industrial sector. I completely agree that for some industrial sectors where the hydrogen is a raw material, it has full sense to use, to produce, and to consume in the same site. But there are a lot of sectors that they have to advance in the decarbonization strategy, and where the infrastructure, the existing infrastructure and modern infrastructure that is without additional investment prepared for a blending, 5–10% of blending of hydrogen, and full prepared for the biomethane, is able to foster the decarbonization of the industrial sector. I think that it's relevant considering the characteristics of the industrial sector in Spain, where in the majority of the cases it's not a big facility which is possible to have the electrolyzer just in the same site.
Hi, I'm Daniel from Hydrogen Europe. Thanks a lot for this interesting exchange. It was very good, Mattia. You show all these different uses, and you talk about the chemical industry not wanting to have any blended gas due to quality. Now, my understanding is that this chemical industry is connected to transmission grid because of the large demand. And then you say it's very inefficient to actually blend for the main purpose. I think, David, you said that it's for heating houses at low temperature. But what about this differentiation between transmission and distribution? I hear a study from a German DSO saying that all the industrial users, except the chemical ones, except the big ones, are connected to distribution grid. And they're saying, we can blend here in this distribution grid. They are made of plastic, polymer, so it just doesn't have to have any retrofitting. We can already blend. And while I will totally agree that heating a house with hydrogen is a very bad idea, you, Matthias, said that the controversial one is about heating industries, high temperature heating. So I wanted to hear from you if that could be a viable solution, so distributed blending, localized, specifically aiming for industrial sectors for high heating, or whether also this is a very bad idea.
Yeah, maybe I start, and if anybody else wants to comment. I think let's introduce this distinction between TSO and DSO level. I think that is very important, otherwise it gets too unnuanced. For the TSO level, I would like to respond one thing that I observed. I think we are all enjoying the regular updates of the European hydrogen backbone. Kind of maps are getting nicer, more interactive. When you look at the last reports of the European hydrogen backbone, so that's the TSO level, I encourage you to look for the word blend. Just search the PDF. It doesn't show up in the main text. You can double check. I think that the longer version comes out in 7th of June or something. But check this year or last year. Yes, among the 28 member states of the member country states of the European hydrogen backbone, you will find in an annex around, I think I counted 5 countries out of 28 that have an interest in blending at the TSO level. Interestingly, I didn't find anything for SNAM. You may double check. For some reason, SNAM doesn't want to blend at the TSO level. But I encourage you to get into that. So, I would say the European discussion, which is very much driven at the TSO level by the TSOs, because they know the stuff best. And the flip side is that we don't know that much, because there's no independent entity to really kind of double check, verify, understand the technical arguments in great depth. There are some efforts by governments to get a more level playing field in terms of knowledge. But my point is the TSOs predominantly are not drivers of the blending debate in Europe. They're not. And you can also talk to Guidehouse and others who work for them. So now let's say for a moment, okay, so really this is not a TSO discussion, honestly. I can confirm that for the German discussion it's not. Maybe there's one outlier among 17 German gas TSOs. And then move to the DSO level. Now we're getting the difficulty, and I agree that the difficulty is TSO, DSO is not very nuanced again, because we're talking about different pressure levels. Or in other words, more like an image, big pipes, small pipes. It's not only one pipe diameter and pressure level at DSO level, it's more complicated. So what we need for the future is to really better understand where is some industry there. And then again, for industry, same thing as for households, really double check for the direct electric alternative. I mean, there are some good reasons why the Dutch government apparently decides to ban gas in household heating. And similarly, industry, we have one study that came out, 40% of the natural gas that European industry consumed in 2019 or 2020, 40% of this whole natural gas volumes was used for heat of, I think, lower than 100 degrees Celsius. So please, if we have low temperature heat in industry, we really need to double check, make sure we're not burning now hydrogen for temperatures below 100 degrees Celsius. That's nuts. It's against everything that David explained for the, the efficiency, the thermodynamics behind that. So we really need, as governments and taxpayers, have the good scrutinizing who's burning what, for which purpose. I'm not saying it's always easy in practice to transform an industry which needs to produce and earn money to a direct electric alternative. But in one of our publications, you can see a nice overview from an academic publication insisting that even temperature levels up to, you name it, several thousand degrees Celsius can be done without molecules. Again, I'm not saying it's always feasible. But if you are in doubt, an electric arc furnace in use today delivers like 3,500 degrees Celsius, period. It is possible to take electricity, produce heat. So the discussion around, and our industry team is actually working on this right now, direct electric solutions for industry at different temperature levels is absolutely critical to limit the volumes of hydrogen we need. And there will be, front runners, I guess, are the glass people. Glass producers always say, well, we are special. Fine. Okay, so they have difficulty to have an electric furnace to produce their glass. I'm all in favor. We're not saying we know all the solutions, but we need to double check for the simple reasons that David mentioned. We're going to lose massive amounts of energy with taxpayers' money if we jump into hydrogen solutions too early. It's the role of governments also to protect taxpayers against too easy solutions without thinking twice. That's why we need all this creativity in industry. Sorry, it takes a bit longer, I realize, but the DSO level is critical because we have all those low temperature applications, and then sometimes we may encounter an industry where it's not as easy. And that's where it gets more difficult. I totally agree. So one idea of Europe is having hydrogen clusters, hydrogen valleys. Most likely, if you're close to an industrial hydrogen valley with big consumers, big flows, yeah, I mean, that sounds likely that maybe in the surroundings of that area, anybody is there with an industry that really relies on hydrogen, for him or her, it will be easier to tap that hydrogen flow. For the others who are way more remote, I mean, get ready for a transformation. Low temperature heat, where natural gas is predominantly used in Germany and some other countries across the planet, get ready for transformation. Think about what's the end game for natural gas pipes, because we will not be able to have all the biomethane in Europe, sustainable source of biomethane, to replace all that with natural gas and biomethane flows. So that's the big discussion. After coal phase out, we'll need to plan for a kind of natural gas phase out in certain way, in certain areas, certain pressure levels. Sorry,
Thanks.
took a bit longer.
So but I'll take one more question and then I'll give everyone on the panel an opportunity to make either a closing statement or a key message that they'd like participants to take away from this discussion. Sonia.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Sonja from Perspectives Climate Group, also in Germany. And I have a bit of a technical question, Matthias, because I was struck by the fact that you mentioned district heating as a potential use case for hydrogen. And actually 2 years ago, I'm not sure if you are aware of that, but the city of Helsinki decided, well, we need to get rid of our existing district heating system, which has been fueled mainly by coal-fired power plants. And they had a kind of a tendering process where people could bring in their ideas how to transform this system. And jointly with the technology partner, we at that point in time thought about the idea, hey, could we potentially transform this coal-fired based district heating system in the city of Helsinki with green hydrogen? And it was a really exciting exercise, but at the end of the day, we decided not to submit a proposal because we realized we run into a storage problem, because obviously the heat demand is much higher in wintertime, where you don't have so much production capacities, whereas it is significantly lower throughout summertime. So essentially you would need to have a system that kind of generates hydrogen during the whole year so that you have sufficient capacities for wintertime. And then we realized, oh, but we need to have a huge salt cavern or whatsoever so that you can really store that hydrogen. And against that background, I was a bit surprised, but in a positive sense, that you have considered this as a potential use case. And I would be curious to hear from you if you have thought about that specific problem as well, and what kind of solutions you have considered. Thanks.
I tried to be more concise than before. We have, as Agora, commissioned research on a scenario that's called Climate Neutral Germany 2045. At this very high level of abstraction, the consultants derive a world which you can also see in many other scenarios, where you can push for as much renewables as possible in all the German district heating systems. We're talking about Hamburg, Mannheim, Munich, you name it. That's big systems. It's not the small ones where you have a new district heating system. I mean, get all the renewables in there you can. Have a low flow temperature, do it. The old legacy systems with the coal, that's the big challenge. In those legacy systems, the flow temperature is around 120, 130 degrees Celsius. No easy deal with only renewables, especially if property and land is scarce and you can have big solar thermal everywhere. Many hurdles. For this, the modeling at an abstract level says, yeah, let's cover this only the residual heat load. We're not saying, oh, let's go with big-time hydrogen into those grids. No, it's like, if there is a residual, if so, then let's consider the seasonal storage. And of course, like I think for most European modeling, I would say, if we're talking about this interconnected European TSO grid of hydrogen of the future, there needs to be massive storage. Northern Germany is in a privileged position with potentially the geological storage and salt caverns. Salt caverns basically seen as the least cost opportunity for storing, and there you would try to connect all that. The grid itself is a storage system, at least temporarily, and then deliver those flows to cities, big cities, where you cover the residual heat load after putting everything you can, renewables, utility scale solar thermal, waste heat, heat pumps, big time heat pumps, utility scale heat pumps, very important, attach that to your rivers. All those solutions, if you're interested, happy to engage into more detailed discussions, but that's kind of also what we can see with the big time operators, Berlin, Hamburg, Mannheim, Munich, but it won't be easy. And there's a tendency to jump into the hydrogen solution too early without scrutinizing all the other options.
Well, this comes back to the point about that different countries or different cities are at different stages in this transition. I'm a relative newcomer to the hydrogen community. When I started work on this, looking at green hydrogen, the narrative, well, green hydrogen is 2035. 2040. And that all seemed to change in and around COP26, actually, and especially this year in Europe. We've seen this extraordinary acceleration of timeframes. So where people were talking in some countries about green hydrogen in 2035, they're now talking about 2030 or 2025. So some of these ideas around blending that we're kind of saying, well, we're going to need natural gas for a very long time. Green hydrogen is going to come in slowly. So the debate around blending in some countries is changing very, very quickly. And again, I guess one of the principles that we're working on is, again, dialogue, working through those case studies in a evidence-based and logical way. So I wanted to give everyone, maybe I'll start in reverse order and give you the first word this time, David, because we're now eating into your precious lunchtime, which is a cardinal sin when you're organising a conference. People need a bit of time to decompress. So David, a closing insight, please.
I would definitely prefer to eat lunch than eat this. Yes. Well, I think on that last question, there was a question about storage, and hydrogen is jumped into as a answer for long-term storage. Hydrogen is terrible for storage of electricity. It's really terrible. The efficiency going from renewable electricity through electrolysis, through storage, pump compression and storage, and then back through fuel cell or whatever, about 30% round trip efficiency. You throw away 70% of the energy on the way through that process. It's about the worst way of storing electricity. And in fact, if you look at reports on energy and electricity storage, it doesn't even rate. It's not even there as a solution. So I wouldn't jump into hydrogen as a solution for electricity. I think if I was going to electricity storage, there's a whole bunch of other technologies with much higher round-trip efficiencies, which you would use first. So I can't comment on Matthias's, this issue with these large district heating schemes. I think that's a particular problem in Germany and a few other countries. I can see there's a need for residual hydrogen there. But otherwise, for heating, heat pumps are a way better solution. They satisfy the requirements of using the minimum amount of energy and requiring the minimum amount of additional renewables creation, and that is a critical thing if we're going to reach these very fast transitions that we need to achieve over the next 10 or 15 years, with massive increase of electrification of transport and massive increase of electrification of electricity. It's vital we do that in the most efficient way possible. Otherwise, we simply won't be able to make the renewables that are needed. And the prospect of making 6 times more renewables in order to heat our houses is just frankly ridiculous. And so blending in the gas grid on average as a way to aid that just doesn't make any sense as far as the energy transition is concerned. So green hydrogen industry should be really careful not to make that misstep.
Flo.
I think I'll add a bit onto that on the storage part too, and going back to the heating. We also have to think about hydrogen and its derivatives, right, which is something we haven't really talked about today because we're focusing on natural gas grids. So you have ammonia, which is there's a very strong case for ammonia because it can be used not only directly, but to store hydrogen, transport hydrogen, and it can open up a whole other sector of the economy to decarbonize, especially some industries like shipping. And then going back to the question of, and that could be a viable alternative on storing hydrogen, because I agree, storing hydrogen as a way to store renewable electricity is the most inefficient way. It doesn't work. You have to compress it. Not all countries have salt caverns, and some countries have to look at alternatives like ammonia. And going back to that point again, Japanese countries, again, they're looking at blending hydrogen into their natural gas infrastructure, especially for power, because they have no alternative. So we have to remember that what may be a terrible solution for us here in Europe might be the best case they have in other countries. And we can't be so quick to kind of jump in and cross it off the list, because that's all they've got. And they're faced with a very young thermal power plants that they need to decarbonize, and they can't just mothball and stop operating. So they're looking at either burning gas in the turbines or other solutions that might not make sense for us. So we have to look at it, each country is very unique, and we have to remember that.
Yeah.
I completely agree. We are in times of change, and we have to continue advancing the strategy of decarbonization. And I think the most relevant question is to have in mind that all the alternatives are required, and obviously, in each case, in each sector, in each economy, some of them will be more viable economically than others. But the question is to contribute to the energy transitions based on economic efficiency with considering all the alternatives. For me, it's the most relevant message.
And Matthias.
So if you remember my table from the beginning, our main message is let's focus on no regret hydrogen applications that show up in all the energy scenarios, and that's where we have to put our money, our planning, all our efforts, and scale that. That's the right direction. One thought, additional thought, if we decided to go into more decentralized distribution grids, low temperature level heating, there's one caveat, and we don't have all the answers to this yet. Just a little reminder, there's uncertainty about the global warming potential of hydrogen. So we are here because everybody, yeah, hydrogen economy, let's go. And still, there's this open issue. There's recent research. I know that the German federal government is now commissioning additional new research. I think Norwegians are doing research. If it happens that the global warming potential of hydrogen is in the order of like 10 with the GWP 100, well, then we should also keep in mind hydrogen will replace many, many more dangerous emissions, which is the good side. On the flip side, it will have some global warming potential. And we make it much worse if we then distribute it in very small, low pressure level pipelines everywhere, because we will increase the risk of more leaks and fugitive emissions. As long as hydrogen has a global warming potential larger than zero, this is a strong argument to work with it carefully, dedicated, no-regret hydrogen applications, because no one can heal that. If you want to distribute it everywhere, and we know then, maybe in some years, we can settle on a value for global warming potential, that operator would need to offset the residual emissions through negative emissions to get to a net zero world. So I encourage us to focus again on the global warming potential, even if it's only residual for hydrogen.
That's the perfect segue. We have a session this afternoon about this. We're quite careful at the Green Hydrogen Organization. People often talk about hydrogen as zero emissions. That is very appealing, but as with most things in life, the devil is in the detail. We talk about close to zero emissions. We've set a emissions threshold of 1 kilo CO2. That has to be demonstrated in projects. And this question of hydrogen as a greenhouse gas and fugitive emissions of hydrogen is something that does not feature in this. This is not perfect. There will be a second iteration and a third iteration. So that's an issue we can come back to this afternoon. It's lunchtime. Thank you all for joining today. Please give our panelists a round of applause.